Hey everyone, sorry it took me a while to get back to you all, but I've been a bit occupied. Anyway, here's some more of the note. It was 3 hours later, with my stomach rumbling, that I was removed from my makeshift prison by three rough looking men. I recognized one of them, the largest of them, as the bearded man who'd been holding the lantern in my cabin. They did not speak to me, only ushering me along. As they moved me, I took in my surroundings. I was in a small village up in the mountains. It was mostly very unimpressive, just a lot of poorly made cabins. Mine was probably better built. However, it seemed to be in the process of being improved. Based on the foundations I could see, it seemed the group was in the process of building several stone houses. Also impressive was the massive crater in the center of the village, fenced off and labeled as a holy site. But most noticeable of all was the foreboding cave entrance situated at the back of the village, which is where the three men were taking me. As we moved through the village and closer to the cave, I was able to lay eyes upon some of the village's residents. Most looked as unremarkable as the shoddy cabins. Some ate and drank around a fire, others were knelt in silent prayer, a couple of others were chopping firewood, one was skinning a deer. One thing that was noteworthy was the mixed nature of the crowd, and while most of the denizens were unremarkable, the armed men were quite a sight. Armed to the teeth, with bandoliers and some strange sort of war paint on their faces. I wonder if any of them had been involved in killing that poor woman. As we approached the entrance of the cave, I noticed a small stage nearby. I correctly assumed that this is where the Reverend must have been giving his sermons from. My heart sank as we marched into the cave. Nothing good was gonna happen in there, that much I was sure of. With my feet practically turned to stone, I was more dragged than walked into the depths of the cave. Despite the darkness of the cave, the lanterns in there did a reasonably good job of lighting the place. Vision was of no issue as I was marched into what turned out to be a network of caves. I was roughly shoved into one of them, and I found myself looking into the pierced glare of an old man that I almost instantly recognized as the Reverend. It had to be him. He was very old, very bald, and very fat, just as that woman had described him. He was truly a disgusting sight to behold. In addition to being grossly overweight and filthy, he was hobbled with a cane, fixed in an unsightly, hunched posture. Moreover, his clothes were a little more than tattered rags. I could tell that they had once been vestments, but their best days were behind them. Could he have actually been a real reverend at some point in time?
The trespasser, I presume.
He asked calmly. I had no idea I was. I was starting to plead my case but was cut off.
That sounds like an admission of guilt.
He said matter-of-factly, before turning his attention to the large bearded man.
Silas, what is the status of the child you recovered from the heretic?
I was overcome with a new sense of revulsion as I realized that one of the perpetrators of that brutal murder was in my company. I should have listened to her and fled.
It died last night. Was it strong enough?
The man apparently named Silas said gruffly.
Unfortunate. But the heretic is to blame, and she has already paid the ultimate price. Now, what does the trespasser have to say for himself?
Sir, I started to plead. I had no idea that this land was taken. I was only seeking refuge in nature. I had no intention of disturbing you. He regarded me in silence for a few moments before issuing his edict.
Dispose of him.
He said coldly. My heart began pounding rapidly and my legs shook. I was going to be killed. I begged. I fought against the men holding me, but to no avail. I was subdued and whisked out of the cave and marched back towards the exit. I began silently praying, something I hadn't done in a long time. Just when all seemed lost, I received an unlikely reprieve.
Louis?
A man's voice called out my last name. I turned my head as best I could and saw a thin, gray-haired man walking towards us.
Stop.
He called to the men dragging me.
Stop, you goddamn idiots.
What do you want now?
Silas said in a vexed voice. The gray-haired man admonished him to watch his tone before turning his attention back to me.
Byron Lewis?
He asked. Yes, I answered weakly. I hadn't the faintest idea who this man was or how he knew me.
Don't you recognize me?
He asked.
We were in the war together. I was one of the medics.
I looked at him, drugging the depths of my cursed war memories before remembering. If this was who I thought it was, I was looking at the medic who had deserted in the dead of night to avoid being hung for murder. Samuel Gray?
Yes,
He affirmed before turning to the guards again.
I need a helping hand in my laboratory, and I'll vouch for his character. Let him go.
But Reverend Borden said,
Silas protested.
Doesn't sound like I give a damn what he said.
Gray cut him off sharply.
I said I want Mr. Lewis with me.
I silently prayed that Gray would win the argument. I still had no idea what this community was or what they believed, but I knew Gray was all that stood between me and death. Before Silas could push back, Gray continued his push.
Talking mouthpieces are replaceable. Carrington can find another preacher. Medical expertise is far more elusive.
Silas processed Gray's words for several seconds, clearly enraged, before shoving me towards Gray.
"You are one lucky bastard."
He spat before stalking off into the caves, grousing that he hadn't gotten to whip anyone to death for weeks. I had 1,000 questions for my savior swirling in my head, but all I could muster at the moment was a thank you. It would soon be one I wished to rescind. My disgust would only grow as I realized just how twisted these people were, just how twisted Gray was. This latter point I learned that same night. "So, what exactly happened with you and the regiment?" I asked Gray as I followed him through the dimly lit labyrinth.
They were gonna hang me.
He said.
I saw so many horribly injured and maimed men out there. Sometimes a killing is the ultimate mercy. I ended the suffering of those men with a large dose of morphine. Leadership was none too keen when they learned of it.
I was ambivalent about this revelation, I admitted. I don't necessarily think mercy killings are immoral, but then Gray kept talking and I learned the depths of his depravity.
The thrill was too much for me to hang up my hat.
Gray continued.
I loved being the decider and continued putting the less fortunate out of their misery. The crippled, the lame, the destitute, the beggars, the whores. But again, the law saw it differently.
I struggled to conceal my revulsion. I wanted to stay on Gray's good side. I tried to change the subject. "So, who is Carrington?"
He is the great leader and prophet.
Gray answered.
He is the most enlightened man alive. He has discovered the true nature of existence and shares it with all. He brings men under one roof of wisdom, rich and poor, city folk, country folk, white and black, northern, southern. He offers it to all. He picked me out of the gutter and resurrected me. I'd lost everything. My profession, my livelihood. I was a husk of a man. Carrington made me whole again. He needed a man of science and medicine, and I needed purpose in life. He heralded my rebirth and that of many others here.
That was a lot to take in, and I was a bit concerned at how worshipped he was. But I was also confused. What purpose did that reverend serve then? I asked about the reverend, prompting a sneer from Gray.
He's an old fool, and one to soon outlive his purpose. The day will come when Carrington has no need for him, but for now, Carrington needs a mouthpiece. He was deeply harmed when he drank from the fountain of knowledge and feasted upon their wealth of erudition.
Gray said with passion. He clearly knew a lot by heart, or at least his own positions and opinions on the church. Before I could ask anything else, we arrived at Gray's laboratory. Gray pulled back a makeshift curtain to reveal a large and cavernous section of the cave. Even with the lanterns, it was poorly lit. It was, for the most part, unremarkable, but there was one incredible sight to behold. A dead creature preserved in a giant glass container. It was inhuman, twisted, and elongated. When I inquired about it, Gray told me that it had come crashing to earth in a screaming ball of metal and fire in 1865, where the sacred crater was. It had been discovered by Borden and Carrington, and the latter had consumed the creature's flesh and blood. It provided great knowledge and longevity, but at a tremendous physical cost. I decided to stop asking so many questions. I knew I was in a horrible situation, but I had to play along. I knew that if I were to survive and escape, I would have to bide my time and patiently wait for an opportunity to escape. And bide my time I did, and I became awfully familiarized with the place and these people. Not everything was all bad. My quarters in the lab cavern were nice, nicer than what most got. They were a small room of sorts in the back of the laboratory, constructed with makeshift wooden frames and deer hides for a privacy barrier, with a bed and a small chest inside. I also became familiar with the denizens, many of whom were polite and cordial, but I also became acquainted with the evil and sinister aspects that far outweighed the small good. I became familiar with those unsettling sermons from that decrepit Reverend Borden, and I became familiar with the fact that silence was the law and order of the village, doling out beatings to the others regularly, in addition to seeking and upon receiving permission from Borden to inflict more than a mere beating. It soon became commonplace to see Silas flogging some poor soul who had incurred his wrath, and I eventually learned Silas's affinity for the whip was rooted in his past as an overseer before the war. The loathsome bastard had found a place to continue his life's calling of inflicting pain. I also became aware of the fact that many of the community members were robbers and bandits, frequently attacking stagecoaches and caravans. I know this because their fresh corpses were brought back to the laboratory for Gray to experiment with. Those experiments still make me shudder. Worse still was the fate of the women that were nabbed in these robberies and raids. They were often to Borden as a tribute until he tired of them. After that they were given to Silas, but they never lasted long after that. That man still makes me sick to my stomach, but I need to stop rambling and get back on track. Back to those wretched experiments that still haunt my mind. The very next day, in fact, Gray conducted one. That morning, a couple men arrived in the laboratory and delivered the corpse of a freshly killed man. By the looks of his garments, he'd been a wealthy man, almost certainly a stagecoach passenger. Gray wasted no time, sawing the dead man's head off with sickening glee. As he did so, he explained he was trying to resurrect and reanimate the dead, specifically the brain. He also thought the brain could connect with other realms of life, potentially. He was removing the head, he said, to prevent resistance if the brain were to be fully restored. He placed the head on a table before fetching a syringe filled with a mysterious green liquid. He explained that he'd been attempting to mix the blood of that inhuman creature with various medicines that a contact of his purchased from the pharmacist at the nearest town. Despite my strong disgust, I was still fixed at the sight as Gray injected the substance into the skull. Several seconds passed, and then the impossible happened. The eyes and mouth popped open. The eyes still looked lifeless, but they were open and moving. And the mouth, it was opening and closing, as if trying to talk or exhale, but had no lungs to exhale with. It felt like minutes, but it was likely just a few seconds before all movement stopped, and the head became lifeless and still once more. Even if I was completely stricken with awe and apprehension, Gray cursed the failure and slammed a fist on the table in frustration. He ranted about how there was no duration or sentience, and that he tried so many times. He proclaimed that a living subject was needed. Much as I wanted no part in it, I knew I'd be a subject if I objected. I kept my mouth shut. It was several days later when I learned that Gray had obtained a living victim, a woman taken from the latest stagecoach raid. I also learned that Gray had only gotten his subject after a tremendous fight with Borden. Borden was infuriated at the loss of a tribute, but Gray had apparently gone to Carrington about it. I had not seen or heard him yet. Gray had said I was not allowed to meet him, and the alleged prophet and reclusive leader had apparently ruled in Gray's favor. I still hate myself for taking part in this, even though I know I had no choice. It had been about 2 weeks since I'd arrived that the experiment began on a freezing January night. She was strapped to a table, the same one that the head had been placed on. I felt enormous guilt and pity as I looked into her eyes. Her eyes were filled with nothing but terror. Something about her eyes said that she was a kind and charitable woman, the kind who would stand being married to a damaged soul such as myself. But I was always doomed to be a childless bachelor. Sometimes I still dream about killing Gray, rescuing her, escaping with her, and starting a life together. But it was not meant to be.
"Please let me go,"
She said to me.
"Please, mister, you look different than other monsters here."
Before I could begin to respond, I heard Gray approaching. Despite the risk, I muttered that I was sorry. I was, and still am.
This is a big day for science and humanity,
Gray said cheerfully.
You'll be going where no other human has ever gone before, Miss,
Hayes.
She answered him fearfully.
Right, Miss Hayes. You will be having an out-of-body experience. We are going to see the true power of the human mind. Dead brains have proven insufficient. Lewis, the syringe.
Gray said with his typical air of confidence. I wordlessly handed it to him. I never understood what the concoction was, nor have I ever wished to. Hayes breathed rapidly as Gray injected the substance into a vein in her arm. He'd earlier explained that he didn't want to puncture a living brain and sabotage the experiment. She cried out in anguish the instant the injection was made and convulsed wildly against the restraints for several seconds before going still. I thought she was dead or unconscious, but then she began speaking. Is anyone there? She called out.
We are here.
Gray answered.
Your body's still here.
She didn't seem to hear us. Gray snapped his fingers over her head several times, but she did not respond. Suddenly she let out a piercing scream.
What are you? Somebody help, they're everywhere.
She screamed over and over before going silent. Then she spoke again, only it was no longer her, or any human for that matter.
Finally, a means for us to communicate.
The rough and scratchy voice said.
Who are you?
Gray asked with great interest.
We are the future, the supreme beings, exiled from your earth long ago and regulated to this realm. For time untold we have watched, unable to interact, but you just opened the threshold. We have watched you fools and your feeble leader try to open up your realm of life so foolishly. Your ancestors, those who were gifted, sacrificed themselves to seal us off. Then your community came along. We are gods, fallen gods, and we will be worshipped once more. The mere sight of our true forms will.
Before it could continue, Gray drove a large knife through the body's head. Lucky that he had the cognizance, as I had been fixated on the thing's monologue. Fortunately, destroying the brain seemed to work, for it fell silent.
We need to control things better before doing anything else with that.
He said with a ragged breath.
The other realms will destroy us unless we use caution. We need to be able to observe these realms without fear of harming ourselves or letting them in.
I was relieved and surprised that Gray was prudent enough to know when to slow down. I'd feared his fixation on science would have kept him going, but it didn't. But I knew this reprieve was ephemeral and that the sick experiments would soon resume. Things were about to get so much worse. Not only were the experiments about to worsen, but the powder keg of tension between Gray and Borden was about to ignite. All hell was about to break loose. I have to take a break now. Other stuff must take precedence in my life, but I'll upload more soon.